Mary Wollstonecraft, The Vindication of the Rights of Women, or at least an excerpt from it. Now, Wollstonecraft presents her view essentially in the context of virtue theory, similar to that of Aristotle and Confucius. Now, like many virtue theorists, or perhaps most of them, she has an interesting view of wealth. On one hand, sort of a negative view, but as we'll see, on the other hand, a positive view. Now, in regards to the negative view, she claims that evil flows from respect paid to property. And the problem of this is that good qualities, good dispositions, are prevented from developing into virtue. And the reason for this, as she sees it, is that the various economic classes compete to gain respect through property. And this is a problem because property gains the respect that is actually due only to talents and virtue. So as she sees it, the main problem with wealth is not that wealth itself is evil, but the way people respect property disproportionate to what should be respected. And as she sees it, it's not property that's respectable, it is talents and virtues. Now, one of the greatest of the dangerous forms of wealth for her is hereditary wealth, which is basically, making wealth the old-fashioned way, inheriting it from one's parents. Now, she believes that hereditary wealth and inherited titles, because she's writing in Britain in the 1700s, and when there's still royalty, and of course we still have it today, which basically they exist nowadays for the tabloids to follow and take pictures of them. But during those days, royalty was even more powerful and influential. So someone could be like a duke or a duchess or whatever, simply by inheritance, not earning it through any effort of their own part, simply being born to the right parents. And she sees this as bad because it produces idleness, and people can only develop their faculties, as Aristotle would say, by exercising them. And if someone doesn't have the motivation necessity, they generally won't do so. So she sees this basically as impeding virtue because people are able to get this wealth without any effort, and hence they tend not to develop their virtues. Now, much like Aristotle and Confucius, she believes the way one acquires virtues is by discharging duties, and someone who has been flattered by sycophants will generally not regard these duties as particularly important. She regards, like most of the virtue theorists, and of course many feminists, that what is critical to morality is having more equality in society, and she considers a lack of equality to be problematic. And one of the problems is dependence as an impediment to virtue. And she claims that virtue cannot be expected from women until they are in some degree independent of men, because mere natural affection cannot make them good wives and mothers, and she claims, which is a point that could be disputed, that while dependent on their husbands, they'll be cunning, mean, and selfish. So she regards the dependence of women upon men as an impediment to development of virtue, which is something that later feminists will present as well. Now, other impediments to virtue include things we generally think of as positive, at least two things, namely wealth, we generally regard as good, charm is good, and presumably hereditary property, getting something just by the luck of being born, perhaps good as well. But she sees these as problematic. Why? Well, firstly, in regards to wealth, when men simply have the wealth and women live by their charms, they won't be engaged in those duties that require exertion and self-denial, as she claims. And also, hereditary property, she claims, sophisticates the mind. It tends to impede the use of the body or mind. And as she sees it, the problem with these things is that the focus on wealth, the focus on charm, and the receiving of hereditary property prevents people from actually acting in ways that would develop their virtue. And she believes, much as we saw in Aristotle, that society should compel both men and women to discharge their duties. So she regards the state, or at least society, as having an important role in this. Now, a good question, of course, is, so why should people, not place so much emphasis on this wealth, charm, and property, why, go for the alternatives? Well, she gives a standard answer presented by virtue theorists, namely this. When people simply respect wealth and personal charms, this is say, beauty and appearance, that will blight affection and virtue. When a woman is admired simply for her beauty, and because of this neglects her duties, then she sins against herself by not making herself useful and happy. And so Wollstonecraft's reply to the question of why is this all bad, her answer is people won't be happy. They may think that they're doing the things that make them happy by aiming for wealth, or focusing on their beauty, or for those who are lucky enough to have hereditary property. The Wollstonecraft's view is that they would be mistaken. They would not be truly happy. Now, she regards woman as being trapped within slavery. Now again, she's writing in the 1700s, so it is a fair question to ask, is what she says still applicable today? Now, one question that all feminists have to deal with is the question of the role of men in this misery and oppression. Are men actively involved? Do men know what they're doing, etc.? Now, feminists, of course, give varying answers depending on their views. For example, those that speak of a patriarchy that's engaged in oppression will generally place men, or at least some men, in a very active role, a system of institutionalized sexism against women. Now, Wollstonecraft takes a fairly moderate view. Her view is that, in general, men are unaware of the misery they cause by their decision, their actions, to focus on making women pleasing to them. And she says, without realizing this, they make the natural and artificial duties clash. And so her view is, interestingly enough, is that first, men are not engaged in this through sort of a malicious intent. In general. Obviously, individual men who are, abusive or harming women, they know what they're doing, and of course they're doing it through intent. But she's sort of talking about the general system. And so her view is essentially men are acting in ignorance for the most part, which of course is a point that could be disputed. And there are, other thinkers who of course take the view that in general men are well aware of this, and there's an intentional systematic program to oppress women, which is of course one of the key questions in regards to sexism and gender equality, namely, how does the oppression work, and what are the roles of men and women in this? Now, she's also concerned very much with the matters of rank. Now, in the British society of this time, there was, of course, a very rigid class structure. They had nobility, you've got like your king, queen, well, back then, of course, the king, but now we've got the queen, and then you had your duchesses and dukes and so forth. And of course, in our society, even though we don't have nobility, we definitely have a class system, primarily economic classes. We have middle class, lower middle class, rich, super rich, etc. Now, she thinks that this class system, this distinction of ranks, are bad because respectability, as she sees it, is not attached to what a person actually does in terms of fulfilling their obligations and duties, but to their stations. And so basically people are respected not because of what they do, but because of where they happen to sit in the hierarchy of society. And again, her view is that this leads to a defect in virtue. Now she notes that a man might be able to slip free and to dare think and act for himself. But as she sees it, in the time period she was writing, for a woman it is a Herculean task. After Hercules' famous labors, fighting the Hydra, clearing the stables, etc. And because in addition to facing the difficulties of the system itself, women also have to face sexism. And so her claim is that it's difficult for men, but even more difficult for women. And again, an interesting question to consider is, what about today? Is this still a problem today? Now she proceeds again to address the matter of wealth once more. As I mentioned before, virtue theorists and feminists are often very concerned about wealth. And virtue theorists, as we've seen, have sort of a two-angle view on it. On one hand, wealth that can be seen as corrupting and a problem for virtue. On the other hand, though, they generally don't see it as sort of inherently evil in and of itself. Now, as Wollstonecraft sees it, on one hand, the bad thing about wealth is this. Because during the time she was writing, women didn't really have any way to make money on their own. They couldn't be typically, lawyers, doctors, etc., engage in careers. And in order to acquire such wealth, they would have to be, they have to acquire a man. And the man would basically earn the money, and the woman would have access to it that way. And so our concern is, this has a very negative impact on women. First, if they achieve this wealth, they'll become weak, because of the luxury provided by the wealth. And to acquire it, they'll become slaves to their persons, because they have to, look beautiful to attract the appropriate man. And if they're ambitious, she claims, they must govern their tyrants, the men, by sinister tricks. And so her view is that the bad thing about the wealth system of her time is that in order to acquire wealth, women have to engage in these non-virtuous behaviors. Now again, fast forwarding to today, there's that question. Can women acquire wealth today in different ways? And the answer, of course, is yes, they don't rely completely on men, but the question still remains about the influence of wealth in regards to morality. Now, she also raises the point about laws. Now, in the time she was writing, the laws were such that a man and the wife were regarded as, a single unit in a way. And only the man was considered to have sort of robust legal status, and the woman was effectively reduced to nothing. And this, of course, raises questions about laws regarding marriage today, namely how women are regarded. Now, in the United States, clearly, marriage is pretty well balanced. Most states, one way to sort of look at this is look at what happens when marriage fails. What sort of things happen? And of course, back quite a while ago, generally divorce was fairly bad for women. Nowadays, it's still pretty bad for those involved in it, of course. But today, this is sort of the standard in most states, including Florida, is the 50-50 split. Each person takes half. And on one hand, of course, you might say, well, this is kind of fair because they split the resources evenly. On the other hand, of course, people often, point out that generally they weren't earned 50-50. But anyways, there's obviously today considerable changes in these matters, at least in the United States. But of course, we shouldn't just think solely about our own country, for those of us who are Americans, but around the world as well. And if you look at the rest of the world, the notion of equality in marriage is, in many cases, simply not present. And so Wollstonecraft's points still seem relevant today. With the next video, we'll press on to part 2 of Wollstonecraft, and then finish up after part 2 with part 3.